Snowstorms don't just trap people. They trap emotions, thoughts, and decisions you'd never imagine making. I learned that the hard way one bitterly cold December evening at the family cabin. Thomas, my husband, was called away for work last minute, leaving me to head up to the cabin alone to check things before the next storm hit. Jack, his son from a previous marriage, offered to help, saying he could use the fresh air. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But the storm arrived earlier than expected, with snow piling up so quickly that leaving wasn't possible. The cabin's old heater sputtered and went out, leaving only a weak fire to warm us. By night, it was almost as cold inside as it was outside. Make sure to subscribe to my channel, so I can continue bringing you more fascinating true stories like this one. And don't forget to watch this video till the end, and like the video because this story is going to be incredibly interesting. Please hit the like button to show your support. We need to conserve heat, Jack said, his breath visible in the dim light. We reluctantly gathered blankets on the couch and sat close. It felt awkward, too personal at first, but as the hours passed, the cold made us forget the discomfort. The storm howled outside, snow piling relentlessly, and the fire grew weaker. By nightfall, the furnace completely stopped working. We huddled together, wrapped in blankets, trying to salvage what warmth we could. I think it's colder in here, I said, pulling my blanket tighter. Jack nodded grimly across from me. It is, he replied. If the fire goes out, we'll freeze. His words sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. The storm had caught us off guard. No power, no cell service, no escape. Jack stood to add more logs to the fire. This should keep us warm for a little while, he said, glancing at me. But we need to stay close for body heat. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. You mean? He shrugged, serious but understanding. We share blankets until the storm passes. I wanted to refuse, to insist we'd be fine, but the cold was undeniable, and I knew he was right. Hey, I said softly. Jack grabbed the thickest blankets he could find and draped them over the couch. I joined him, settling beside him awkwardly. Is this okay? He asked, his tone careful. I nodded, avoiding his gaze. It's fine. At first it felt unbearable, physically and emotionally. I was aware of every inch of space between us. But as the hours went on, the cold forced us closer together, and I started to feel less aware of the tension. Better? Jack asked softly, his breath visible in the dim light. Yes, I said, though my voice trembled. The silence grew heavy, only broken by the sound of the wind outside. Finally, Jack spoke. This storm is worse than I thought, he said. I nodded. It's been years since I've seen one like this. He leaned back, his expression thoughtful. I used to love coming up here as a kid. My mom and I would stay for days, just the two of us. His mention of his mother surprised me. Jack rarely talked about her. You must have been close, I said. Yeah, he replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. She made this place feel like home. I felt a pang in my chest. I had tried to fill that role after marrying Thomas, but I had always felt like an outsider. I'm sorry if I haven't measured up, I said softly. Jack turned to me, confused. What do you mean? I know I'm not her, I stammered. And I know it hasn't been easy for you having me in your life. He shook his head. You've been good to me, Ava, better than I deserve. The sincerity in his voice made my breath catch. Time passed and the fire continued to weaken. Jack shifted closer, pulling the blankets tighter around us. Cold? He asked. I'm fine, I said, my teeth chattering slightly. Here, he said, wrapping his arm around me. At first I stiffened, but the warmth was undeniable. Slowly I leaned into him as the cold retreated. You're like a human heater, I joked, trying to ease the tension. He chuckled. Guess I'm good for something. We sat in silence for a moment, the storm raging outside, while the intimacy of the moment felt overwhelming. As the night wore on, I found myself growing more comfortable with Jack, and the barriers between us started to fall away. Tell me something about yourself, he asked suddenly. I glanced up at him, surprised. Like what? Anything, he said. Something I don't know. I thought for a moment. I used to want to be a painter, I said, but life got in the way. Thomas had his career and I let my dreams fall aside. Jack's expression softened. You didn't have to give up what makes you happy. His words stirred something in me. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. What about you? I asked, changing the subject. What did you want to be? He smiled faintly. An architect. I used to draw elaborate plans for mansions and castles. My mom always said I had the imagination for it. What happened? I asked. He sighed. Life got in the way. His words echoed my own, and I felt an unspoken bond form between us. A shared sense of loss for dreams never realized. The next morning the storm had passed. Sunlight poured through the frosted windows, casting a golden glow on the snowy landscape. Jack was already up, stoking the fire to life. He glanced back at me as I sat up. Morning, he said warmly. Morning, I replied, pulling the blanket tighter. The awkwardness from the night before returned, but it was different now, more about the unspoken tension between us than discomfort. We should be able to leave once the roads are clear, he said casually. Good, I said quickly, though part of me didn't want to leave the warmth of the cabin. Later, as we packed to leave, I couldn't help but wonder if the storm had changed something between us, or if I was imagining it. Returning home from the cabin, I thought the tension would fade, but as we unpacked our bags and settled back into the familiar house, I realized something had shifted. Jack started avoiding me, retreating to his room or leaving the house for long stretches, only speaking when spoken to. I convinced myself it was for the best, that the distance would bring us back to normal, but I couldn't ignore how my stomach tightened every time I saw him in the hallway or heard his voice from another room. One evening while I was doing dishes, Jack walked in. He paused at the doorway as if debating whether to leave. Everything okay? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Yeah, he said, stepping inside. I just wanted to thank you for handling everything at the cabin. I dried my hands, surprised by his sincerity. You don't have to thank me, I said. You were the one keeping us alive. He chuckled softly. Still, I appreciate it. For a moment our eyes met and I felt the connection between us once more. The turning point came late one night. I couldn't sleep, my thoughts spinning. I wandered downstairs to make tea and found Jack in the dimly lit living room, reading a book. Up late? I said, startled. He looked up, his expression softening. Couldn't sleep. Me neither, I admitted, sitting across from him. We sat in silence for a while, the clock ticking in the background. Finally, Jack closed his book and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Can I ask you something? He said hesitantly. Of course, I replied. Did it feel different at the cabin? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart raced as I considered my answer. Yes, I whispered. Jack nodded slowly, dropping his gaze. I thought it was just me. It wasn't, I replied, my voice barely audible. The silence that followed felt deafening, but neither of us moved to break it. Eventually, Jack stood and sat beside me. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said, but I can't stop thinking about it. Me neither, I admitted, trembling. When he leaned in, I didn't stop him. The kiss was tentative at first, but it quickly deepened and I knew we had crossed a line. After that night, we tried to avoid each other, pretending nothing had happened, but the pull between us was too strong. One evening, after Thomas left for a week-long trip, Jack and I found ourselves alone again in the kitchen. The air between us crackled with tension. We can't keep doing this, I said, though my voice wavered. Why not? He asked, stepping closer. No one has to know. It's not that simple, I said, leaning against the counter. It could be, he murmured, his hand brushing mine. When his lips met mine again, all my reservations melted away. Our relationship grew more complicated, and the secret we kept became harder to bear. I became hyper-aware of the people around us, especially Clara, who began to notice changes in my behavior. You seem different, she remarked one morning, her eyes narrowing with concern. More alive, I laughed, trying to brush it off. I've just been getting more sleep. Or maybe there's someone or something you're not telling me about, she teased. But her eyes held a knowing sharpness. Her words stuck with me. The tension built, and Greg's curiosity about Jack grew. One evening during a dinner party, Greg cornered Jack in the kitchen. So Jack, Greg said, swirling his wine, what's it like staying here with Ava? Jack stiffened, glancing at me. It's fine, he replied cautiously. Just fine, Greg pressed, his voice light but probing. She's a lovely woman, Greg added, smirking. I excused myself before the conversation escalated, but I knew Greg suspected something more. As time passed, our secret relationship became harder to keep hidden. Jack and I found ourselves sneaking around more frequently, stealing moments when we could. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Jack turned to me, his expression serious. What are we doing, Ava? He asked. I sighed, staring at the moonlit flowers. I don't know, I admitted. I just don't want to hurt anyone. You're not, he said quickly, but it's complicated. He reached for my hand, his grip firm. I'm willing to take the risk if you are. His words sent a mixture of excitement and fear through me. I knew the stakes, but I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Our lives had become a double life. By day, we played the part of a normal family, with Thomas completely unaware. At night, we tiptoed around each other, sharing stolen moments that felt like treasure. The thrill was undeniable, but so was the danger. Each shared glance or touch carried the weight of 1,000 questions. Who would notice, who would tell, and what would happen when they did? One afternoon, while Thomas was at work, Jack and I were alone in the living room. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft golden glow. I sat on the couch, distracted by my thoughts, as Jack leaned against the armrest beside me. His hand brushed mine. Someone might come home, I whispered, glancing nervously at the door. Clara texted. Jack replied. She's taking Thomas to that fundraiser. His words gave me a sense of reassurance, enough to let my guard down, at least for a moment. But as Jack leaned in closer, the sound of the front door opening made my heart race with panic. Ava! Thomas's voice called from the hallway. We scrambled apart, my pulse pounding as Thomas walked into the room. He stopped in the doorway, his brow furrowing slightly. What's going on in here? He asked, his eyes darting between the two of us. Just reading, I said quickly, holding up my book as if it could shield me from his gaze. Jack nodded, maintaining his calm expression. I was just about to head out. Thomas stared at us for a long moment, then shrugged. All right, I thought I heard voices. Once he left the room, I let out the breath I had been holding. That was too close, I whispered to Jack, feeling the weight of the situation. Too close, Jack agreed, his jaw tight. The following days became more complicated. Greg's behavior grew more invasive. His curiosity about Jack seemed to intensify after Thomas mentioned that his son was staying with us. One evening, during a dinner party at our house, Greg cornered Jack in the kitchen. So Jack, Greg said, swirling his wine glass, what's it like staying here with Ava? Jack's posture stiffened and he glanced briefly at me across the room. It's fine, he replied cautiously. Just fine. Greg pressed. She's a lovely woman, isn't she? Jack clenched his jaw. She is, Greg smirked, clearly relishing the discomfort he was causing. I hope you're not giving her too much trouble. Before the conversation could escalate, I stepped in, keeping my tone polite but firm. Greg, do you mind helping Thomas in the dining room? Of course, Greg said with a half smile before leaving the room. I turned to Jack once we were alone. What was that about? Nothing, Jack replied, though his expression told a different story. He's just being Greg. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg suspected more than he let on. As our relationship continued, it became harder to keep the secret from those around us. Jack and I found ourselves sneaking around more often, sharing stolen moments in the early mornings or late at night. One evening, as we sat together in the garden, Jack turned to me, his expression serious. What are we doing, Ava? He asked again. I stared at the moonlit flowers, unsure of how to respond. I don't know, I admitted, but I don't want to hurt you. You're not, he said, but the weight of the situation was clear in his eyes. It's complicated. He reached for my hand, his grip strong and reassuring. I'm willing to take the risk if you are. Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. We continued our secret relationship, living a double life, each moment of stolen affection making the stakes even higher. We played the part of a normal family when Thomas was around, while at night, we navigated a world filled with secrets, looking over our shoulders, wondering when everything would come crashing down. One afternoon, while Thomas was at work, Jack and I found ourselves alone again. The sunlight streaming through the curtains seemed to bring a sense of calm, but I knew it was just an illusion. Jack leaned beside me, his hand brushing mine again. I'm not sure how much longer we can keep this up, I whispered, my voice tinged with anxiety. He nodded, his expression grave. We'll figure it out, but we can't keep pretending nothing's going on. Just then, the sound of the front door opening again made us freeze. Ava, Thomas's voice called from the hallway. My heart dropped into my stomach as we quickly pulled apart, the weight of our actions hanging over us like a cloud. Thomas walked into the room, oblivious to what had just happened. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two of us. "Just reading," I said, trying to keep my composure. I grabbed a nearby book, trying to appear normal. Jack nodded in agreement, though his eyes showed the underlying tension. I was about to head out. Thomas gave us a curious look before shrugging. "All right." Once he left, I could feel the panic fading, but the guilt remained. Jack and I exchanged a glance, the unspoken words lingering in the air. We both knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. As the days wore on, the tension continued to rise. Greg started noticing things, strange glances, awkward silences, and his behavior became more suspicious. Finally, it reached a breaking point when Thomas confronted me one evening. "Ava, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of doubt. I froze, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange," Thomas said, his tone growing more insistent. "And Jack? He's been acting strange too. Is there something I should know?" The weight of his words settled on me, and I knew that it wouldn't be long before the truth came out. The strain of keeping our secret relationship became too much to bear. Jack and I had reached a breaking point, and the constant tension weighed on us both. Our stolen moments, the looks we shared, the closeness we tried to hide, it was becoming unbearable. One evening, after another close call, we found ourselves arguing in the kitchen. "This is getting too dangerous," I said, my voice rising. "Someone is going to figure it out." Jack stepped closer, his expression softening. "We can handle it." "Can we?" I countered, my frustration boiling over. "Feels like everything is falling apart." Jack's voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the same fears I had. "I don't want to lose you, Ava." "I don't want to lose you either," I admitted, feeling the weight of the situation. But even as we reconciled, I couldn't shake the feeling that our time together was running out. The breaking point came one afternoon, when Thomas returned home unexpectedly during one of our secret moments. Jack and I had been in the garden, our voices low as we discussed our next steps. "We need to stop this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's getting too risky." "Do you really want to stop?" Jack asked, his eyes searching mine for an answer. Before I could respond, the sound of Thomas's voice made us jump. "Ava," he called out from inside. We scrambled apart, panic rising in my chest as I heard his footsteps approaching. "Just getting some air," I said quickly, forcing a smile as Thomas appeared in the doorway. His eyes narrowed, studying us both carefully. "What's going on out here?" "Just talking," I said, trying to keep the situation calm. Thomas gave us a suspicious look, but after a long moment he shrugged. "All right." And then, without another word, he left the room. As I exhaled in relief, I couldn't help but feel the walls closing in on us. I whispered to Jack, "That was too close." "I know," he agreed, his jaw tight with frustration. The next day, Greg's interference escalated even further. He showed up unannounced at the house, his demeanor smug as he greeted Thomas. "Greg," Thomas said, surprised by his sudden appearance. "What brings you by?" "Oh, just thought I'd check in," Greg said, his gaze darting between Jack and me, clearly studying us. "I've been noticing some interesting dynamics around here lately." My stomach sank at his words, but Thomas, oblivious to the tension, laughed it off. "Greg, you've always been one for gossip," Thomas said with a chuckle. "Come on, let's have a drink." As Thomas led Greg away to the study, I turned to Jack, my voice low. "We're running out of time." "I know," Jack said, his face grim, "but I'll figure something out." That night, Jack came to me with a plan. "I'll talk to Greg," he said, his voice resolute, "one last time." "No," I said, panic rising in my chest. "You can't trust him." "I'm not asking for his trust," Jack replied, his voice steady. "But if I don't do something, he'll ruin everything." Despite my protests, Jack left the house that night, determined to confront Greg and put an end to his threats. He met Greg at a bar far away from our house, hoping for some semblance of privacy. "This is your last chance," Greg said, sipping his drink with an air of finality. "Leave town or I'll destroy both of you." Jack leaned in, his voice cold. "You think you can control me or Ava? You're pathetic." Greg's smirk faltered, and he leaned in closer. "Careful, kid. You don't want to make an enemy of me." Jack didn't back down. "You already are." Greg stormed out of the bar, his threats lingering in the air. When Jack returned home, he was pale but determined. "It's done," he said. "What did you do?" I asked, fear in my voice. "Nothing illegal," Jack replied, though his tone was evasive. But the peace didn't last. The following morning, Thomas received an anonymous email with damning evidence, enough to unravel everything. Thomas stormed into the kitchen, holding his phone, his face pale with fury. "Ava," he barked, slamming the phone on the counter. "What is this?" I froze, my eyes darting to the phone screen. The subject line was ominous. "The truth about your wife and your son." Below it, a series of photos captured stolen moments between Jack and me. The captions were even worse, filled with venom and accusations. "This has to be a mistake," I stammered, my voice betraying me. Thomas's eyes narrowed as he read the email. "Don't insult my intelligence, Ava. I've known something was off for weeks. Now I know why." Jack entered the room then, his face going pale as he saw the scene unfolding. "What's going on?" Jack asked cautiously. Thomas turned on him, his anger boiling over. "You know exactly what's going on. You've been sneaking around with my wife." "My wife?" Jack stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "Thomas, just listen to me." "Don't you dare tell me to listen," Thomas shouted. "I welcomed you into my home, and this is how you repay me." "It's not that simple," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with tension. "Not that simple." Thomas laughed bitterly. "You seduced her, didn't you? Manipulated her the same way you manipulate everyone else." "That's not what happened," I said, my voice trembling. "Thomas, please, let's talk about this." Thomas cut me off, his voice cold. "I trusted you, Ava. I gave you everything and you threw it all away for him." The word struck me like a knife, but before I could respond, Thomas turned back to Jack. "You're no son of mine. Pack your things and get out of my house." Before Jack could say anything, the doorbell rang. I froze, dreading the worst. When Thomas opened the door, Sabrina stood there with a smug expression. "Sabrina?" Jack asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "I came to deliver the rest of the truth," Sabrina said as she walked past Thomas into the house. "What truth?" Thomas demanded, his voice sharp. Sabrina pulled out her phone and played an audio recording for everyone to hear. It was Jack's voice, low and urgent. "Greg needs to back off. If he doesn't, I'll make sure he regrets it." The room fell silent as the recording finished. Thomas turned to Jack, his gaze filled with suspicion. "What does this mean?" "It's not what it sounds like," Jack said quickly, his voice defensive. Sabrina smirked. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it sounds like. Jack's been playing games, Thomas, with Greg, with Ava, with everyone." Thomas turned to me, his face filled with betrayal. "Is this true? Did you know about this?" "I didn't," I said, but the words felt hollow. "Don't lie to me, Ava," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I don't even know who you are anymore." Jack stepped in between us. "Leave her out of this," he said firmly. "This is all about her," Thomas snapped. "You don't think I see that?" Jack's jaw tightened. "Maybe it has, but you drove her to it. You treated her like an afterthought while you chased your career." "Don't lecture me about my marriage," Thomas growled. The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment I thought someone would strike. Just then, Greg entered the house without knocking, his expression wild. "What's going on here?" Thomas demanded. Greg pointed at Jack. "He threatened me, said he'd ruin me if I didn't keep quiet." Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "You've been blackmailing us, Greg. Don't play the victim." "Blackmail," Thomas repeated, disbelief written across his face. "Yeah," Greg said with venom, "because you deserve to know what's been going on under your roof." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, accusations flying. Finally, Thomas slammed his fist on the counter. "Enough," he shouted. "I don't care who started this. I want all of you out of my house now." I felt the weight of his words crushing me. "Thomas, please save it," he said coldly. "I'll have the divorce papers ready by the end of the week." Jack's face darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of regret. "I'll wait for you outside," he said softly before leaving the room. I stood on the porch watching Jack load his car, the ache in my chest growing. This wasn't how I wanted it to end. "It doesn't have to end," Jack said quietly as he turned to me. I hesitated, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I can't," I said finally, tears streaming down my face. "I've already lost too much." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. "I understand," he said. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away, leaving me standing in the cold. In the days that followed, the fallout consumed me. Clara called repeatedly, concerned, but I couldn't face her. Thomas moved into a hotel, leaving the house eerily empty. I spent my nights staring out at the garden, replaying every choice that had led me to this point. The passion, the risks, the lies, they had all come at a cost I wasn't sure I could bear. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. For the first time in years I had felt alive, even if it had all ended in ruin.